here, I guess. Couple new faces, always welcome. As we're kind of warming up to is there's a couple reasons why we're all here. I don't know if it's necessarily an underlying single reason, but you know, maybe we could do like a little round table of like, you know, why we're here, who we know, or just like a brief introduction kind of thing.
I have one request. Probably silence your phones. That way
that's
you
a
don't
big
pick up
one.
any of that extra little beeping or anything. Not that, I mean, look at them if you need to, whatever. I don't care. I'm not going to stifle your personal life. But as far as beeping and things like that, messing with the microphones, probably a good idea to have that off. Outside of that, let's do what we got to do.
Cool.
Sounds like a plan.
Well, I'll jump in first, I guess, since I was the one who suggested the little topic to introduce ourselves. Anyways, I recently started new employment, and I met a couple guys at work who were interested in philosophy. They immediately asked me if I wanted to come join them for like a discussion group of sorts, and sometimes they'd like to meet at like a coffee shop or someone's house and sort of have like an open-ended discussion from talking about philosophy in general, psychology, history, personal matters, men's issues, work sometimes, but not as much. And I think one of the threads we have in common is that we're seeking something like a brotherhood of sorts, where we can discuss things with the fear of persecution, and we can interrogate each other's ideas and learn new skills and discover new truths, and you know, in general, give ourselves an outlet. You know, kind of separate ourselves from the screens of our everyday lives, like our phones, our computers, our TVs, and be engaged more with other people. So I'm drawn to that, and I always have been, and just really glad that I found this group. And sometimes it takes a new path in life to discover another one. So anyway, so that's me for now. Someone else want to do it? Ivan?
I suppose that I'll just say that the reason for why I'm part of a group like this, and why I believe it's important to have a group like this, is all the things you just mentioned. And in addition, I would say that it's also for the fact of challenging ideas, challenging our presuppositions that we carry, so that we can have a two-part thing happening, where you can have your presupposition even more confirmed in a legitimate way by the challenges involved, by everybody else kind of coming in and even critiquing if it's necessary, or encouraging, or to even have your presupposition challenged to a point where you check yourself a little bit and say, wow, wait a minute, is it really do I have that parochial way of looking at things, that narrow? I don't believe that being open-mindedness is the key also, as well as I don't believe being too narrow is also. They both have their own ramifications. There's a middle ground, and the middle ground, I would say, is ultimately truth. Whether we recognize it or not, I think we are pursuing truth. Even if we don't believe in it, we're still pursuing that validation that it doesn't exist. And if we do believe it, we're pursuing it in a way that it can validate what we believe about truth and instantiate it for us. Also, it's also another part about this is that it's helping us engage with the community around us and build a community of brotherhood, build a community of others who want to think and be challenged and grow intellectually, as well as their soul, to be enriched and to grow as well and understand who they are themselves. You know, the old saying of Socrates says, what is it? The unexamined life is not worth living.
Yeah.
If we dissect a little bit deeper, we understand what does it mean by worth living. That's a whole other conversation in itself. But yeah, that's pretty much the premise of this, as well as the allegory of the cave is another premise to this as well, foundation to this. So build a community of critical thinking, community of exploration, and a critical thinking of understanding what truth is, and with the risk of your presupposition being challenged. So risk is involved, risk is a factor, and that's something that's worth pursuing.
Right. Well said.
Very eloquent. I guess I can go next. Everything both of you have already said, I would say also to encourage people to be more civil, I suppose you could say, for lack of a better way of putting it. There's not much civility if you go on Twitter or YouTube or wherever you would like to go. there's not a whole lot of civility towards people who disagree with each other. And I think that we can set a good example of how that should look, and I think that we can also help people with their communication skills as far as being able to talk to each other and disagree with each other and still come to some kind of conclusion, negotiate some kind of conclusion instead of just spitting venom in each other's face. So those are two really big things for me, is encouragement and communication.
Cool.
Gentlemen?
I'm Jason, good friend of Nathan. Been a friend for a while now. I grew up as a single parent only child. My mother was a aircraft mechanic, helicopter mechanic. She was the first woman in Missouri National Guard history to have expert badges in almost every weapon.
Wow.
Including like assault rifles and sniper rifles. Just because she was so self-determined, because they said she couldn't. She was a karate champion, but not a fighter in any way. Nor was she very avid about military or joining the military. It was just an avenue for her to get training, experience, and better herself in a world that didn't provide those opportunities. So she had to sacrifice a little bit of herself to get that little extra. My grandfather was very philosophical. He had pretty close, he was, they call it eidetic, when you remember everything that happens to you.
You read especially.
He could read a book like this maybe in like, I don't know, a half hour. 400-page paperback books would take about 2 hours. And you could quiz him on pretty much
400
anything.
page?
Yeah, about 2 hours. And you could quiz
So
him
it
on
was
yeah, and you could go, okay, the top of page 203, you'd start reading, and he would finish the sentences for you.
I've watched The Matrix. I've seen how that
he
works.
was weird. He didn't do it to show off. He just loved reading so much. He would read 2 lines at a time.
That's like speed reading, you know?
impressive.
Like usually
Yeah,
I
and
like stare at a
I
page
wish
for
I
like
could
an
have done
hour.
that.
And I think
I wish I
about
could do that too. It's almost information overload. But my mother, my grandfather, and myself would sit around and talk for hours and hours, and that's when Nathan told me about this group. That's what piqued my interest. I'm not sure what the objective is, but I'm in for a discussion. It's been a long time since I've had any of my own thoughts to vocalize to anyone. Being a salaried manager and having a family has taken up 99% of my life, so it'll be nice to have some meaningful conversations. Or not. Wherever they go is fine with me.
At least you're candid about that, which is appreciated, I'm sure.
Definitely.
Cisco?
And feel free to let us know
I
if
will
it's not.
open my mouth in parables. I will utter what has been hidden since the foundation of the world. My name is Cisco, and I did something that was kind of like jumping out of a plane a few years ago. And now it feels like I've kind of restored a peace in my life, that I've wanted, a control of my life that says that my ancestors can smile on me, that my family can be proud of me, that people can mention my name in conversation with there being peace and not hush-hush controversy. In a world that wants to kill me, where my nation, where my family immigrated from, has now lost itself to so sordid corruption, where people fear for their lives and they cannot speak the truths that they see, and they have resigned entirely from being able to communicate the most basic bits of information. I'm speaking literal bits of just necessary medical information, necessary personal information, time-sensitive information. All of these things go second to the impression that you will land when you say. And I fear that my country here in the US is headed towards that direction. And I speak only what I can disclose at the safety that I can in a neighborhood that has become murderous when I used to live in the 1950s paradise of Kearney, Nebraska. And so I'm very grateful for this group to be assembled. And I think that men are searching for the meaning and the peace, especially if we'd like to see a world with children. And I feel like everything I say is like just a pep talk to get me out of the door safe or ready to die with my boots on. So I'm happy to see you guys, and everything I talk about philosophy is about seeds that are being planted.
Yeah.
And so I feel like I'll tell you guys I'm a conservative kind of guy. I like to listen to a few channels on YouTube like Stefan Molyneux, Jordan Peterson, and I've just been observing how conversations work in YouTube, because social media has become so destructive that I've been basically having to keep my identity secret as much as I can to every extent, and now learning cybersecurity at the U of A through MIS and operations management. Can you delete operations management? I don't want to disclose that.
Yeah,
actually.
I'll edit.
Edit that. So I've been kind of like staring at the Facebook share your status screen that says like, all right, there's that little blinking thing, and I'm like, am I gonna get shot if I press that letter? And I'm kind of thinking that, and I'm like, yeah, I'm gonna delete my Facebook, and I haven't been disclosing anything to anybody, and everything that I do disclose to somebody, I'm kind of like, I can breathe. So I'm interested, always kind of gauging every crowd with everything I say, but that's because of philosophy. It started with philosophical conversations. I was a very materialist, atheistic person, and I went through a journey, and I went through very esoteric texts, hermetic texts, and a lot of what Jordan Peterson was talking about, and eventually I found something that was more ancestral, and I always like to talk about that, and you'll notice I start to try to kind of grab a conversation and pull the reins and see, is this kind of comfortable over here? Because I notice everybody's always uncomfortable about even approaching a topic in the public sphere. But among philosophers, people are like, that's an uncomfortable topic. Wow, that's disgusting. Wow, that's stupid. But you know what? I still respect you, and I give you the basic loving courtesy that any human being should offer anyone, like a bystander and a passenger that you're just walking by in an ambience that's peaceful. Because I think of the philosophers who have wine like this and had books like this, wrote these books. The Pythagoreans, they had a very peaceful toga-wearing, peaceful area that they could not speak, unlike the university I see today and the world that I dreamed of as a child that did not come to be. I'm kind of seeing the town that's going to do the witch trials. So I see a hoodwinked crowd and a reality that has been hidden to the world that is not allowed to be uttered. So I'm always looking for permissions at this point, which is kind of great because I'm working with Linux systems, and that's kind of the whole career.
Linux, yes.
Machines are easier to talk to the people. That's the TLDR.
My turn, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, everything you guys said, I'll take one of each, if that's all right with you.
Sure.
But it's a little bit more difficult for me to describe as this goes on. I'm sure everybody will know that I change my mind quite frequently, and I no longer have any problems with that. In the time that Ivan had first invited me out for some discussion, I've seen how this has grown, and I've seen where this is going, and I've been part of a lot of what others would call success, or things that people strive for. I've been part of many of those conquests, so to speak, and they just weren't for me. But this feels pretty good, and I'll be very honest with you. Selfishness is the prime reason in this, to learn, to learn more and more and more and more, because I do believe that learning is the only way that I'm going to get better at anything. And sometimes that consists of teaching, so there'll be times where I'll do a lot more talking than listening, and sometimes that'll consist of listening, because that's probably a better way to understand people, and that's something that we had all spoke about, is the understanding part of things. As far as where I stand on certain things, again, that'll reveal itself, but you can pretty much rest assured that I'm a fence rider. One thing that Ivan knows very well about me is I am very good at playing the devil's advocate for either side. I've lived on both sides. I've seen the brown grass when I thought it was green everywhere, and I'm okay with it. I wasn't for a very long time, but over the last 6 months or so, I would say I'm A-okay with it, and I'm happy to share my observations with people and not put on them that it's a truth other than it's an observation. And if it can help someone, great, and that's my hope. I wouldn't say it's my goal, but I would say it's my hope, and I've said before we started recording, Cameron and Ivan especially know this, will be very, very lucky to help one person in my life. I mean, truly help. There's people you can assist and people you can guide, but to truly, truly help one person would be a fantastic thing to say on my deathbed that I did. So that would work for me. That'll be fine.
I'll sort of piggyback on what a couple of you said, specifically Cisco and Cameron, talking about the YouTube spheres and the media spheres like Twitter and Facebook and whatnot. I'm pretty literate in those regards as well. One of the things that I've noticed though is that there seems to be something missing that's transitional. Not to pick on Stefan Molyneux. I've subscribed to him for years and I really like his call-in shows and I like his Truth of series. But what we see at the end of the day is something of a polished product or something that's completely finished and it's already been edited and whatnot. One of the reasons I was so excited to record these type of sessions is so that people in general who have no contact with a lot of this stuff formally can see the formulation of thought beginning. Now, I may do recordings where I'm reading off a script or I'm going through a program of sorts or Euclidating a point of view or showing the process of discovery, but in between there are these types of discussions which are quite normal and actually has a philosophical significance and heritage. Philosophy used to be done rhetorically as well as most scholarship. Specifically, the ancient Greeks and Romans, it was all done verbally into basically the Middle Ages until people really started becoming more literate in the sense that yeah, it was more than just people in positions of power who could write. You know, more and more people wanted to read things themselves, and I think a big part of that has to do with the Reformation in the Enlightenment period. People became more acquainted with this, with these sort of type of activities. It wasn't just for the elite class anymore. Now, one of the things that encourages me is that while just listening to our guys' brief introductions, that as someone who's been trained formally in the topic of philosophy, I'm seeing all these different little topics pop up here and there, from epistemology to metaphysics to ethics to history to theory of mind to pragmatics. I'm sure politics are going to pop up here and there, and economics. And
I love economics.
I think it'd be helpful from a voyeuristic perspective for someone listening to this, being able to say, hey, I've had those exact same thoughts in the same way that they mentioned it, yet I've never really pursued it beyond that. Listening to these people think out loud rather than just read off a script could be helpful, you know, and also sort of revigorate the tradition of rhetoric, being extremely critical where we need to be and soft spoken and listening where it's necessary.
That's basically everyone I'm subscribed to on YouTube, by the way. I want to catch that real quick before we get too far off.
Yeah. Well, I've done some analysis on that very topic, egocentric and sociocentric network analysis, coming to the actual nodes and actors within the YouTube sphere. So if you want to have more details on that, we can talk about it later. But for now, I think this is a great starting point. Now, I've talked about me and my experiences. I'm kind of curious what people's exposure to the topic of philosophy in general, being like an academic subject, but also other ventures such as, I know we have a couple musicians. I don't know if we have any artists, and it sounded like you were in the military. No? Who was the one who was in the military?
He's referring to this guy, Tony.
Tony. Oh, okay. I thought you might have been mentioned.
I ain't even said that since I got here. When have you discussed that real quick?
You were describing John.
Yeah. Okay. I thought he was saying you were in the middle. Okay. All right. Well, yeah. Give us.
You were really hungry when you said it. So
Wow, really? I said that in that time when I was here.
Yeah,
Wow.
that's the only reason. I
Food
thought he was
is
mentioning
glucose,
you.
man. It makes disabled the
And
brain.
by the way, for those, I didn't actually introduce myself at the very beginning with my name.
Black up of it.
This voice belongs to Nathan, in case anyone's curious.
Yeah, I'm Cameron. You didn't introduce your name either.
Wow, Ivan.
I think everyone else did.
Yeah,
Everybody
I
else
think everyone else did.
I always market myself. I'm Cisco, just like the company, and as you can see in the lecture hall on the big screen above, that the guy.
I think I said Hector, but we'll just say it again. I definitely want to make one thing pretty clear. There are no subjects that are out of reach or off limits. And the reason I say that is because that's one of the biggest barricades people encounter in their first attempt at trying to talk about something, is they feel immediately that it's off topic. Forgive me, I'm butchering the phrase, but basically people say don't talk about politics, and I think that's bullshit. And that leads me
Or
to say,
religion.
or religion, yeah,
And then
absolutely.
it becomes don't talk about gender. And then
Well,
it
it's
becomes,
just-
don't talk about
that's
passing the salt,
Essentially,
pass the pepper.
yes. That's and I'm all for it. And I'm not going to say that they're always going to hear good or bad here. They're going to disagree. They're going to agree at times. But I have no intentions of editing content other than maybe the privacy factor. I mean, you had mentioned your job. We're going to butt that out. But
Yeah,
as far
just
as
like
that's
little
concerned,
numbers and
yeah.
names that are personal information
But-
that can be identifiable.
yeah. I think
Common sense.
the average common sense, exactly, commonsensical things. But outside of that, there's no actual content-driven editing that's going to happen here. I'm going to do more of the engineering side of editing to make us sound like we're semi-professional. At
Yeah.
the same token, not sitting on a ivory tower.
All right, Ivan. Now that I've seen your bookshelf, I'm kind of curious. You're obviously not just a collector. You're a good reader. What got you interested in the some of the more Christian apologetic stuff, like C.S. Lewis?
It's a default. It's all a default. What I mean by that is that life is really interesting. I really believe in the synchronicity of things. Every moment has an intention. Every moment is linked.
Like a Jungian synchronicity?
Like a Jungian synchronicity, and by that I mean that every event and everything that happens in life has a connection and it has a correlation or even a overlap. For instance, even like the bad or the good, we always say things very cliche, like everything happens for a reason, and that's nonsense because it's exactly that. It's a cliche. It has no meaning. It has lost its value. You throw in words into something so you can kind of bandage a moment of awkwardness or a moment of you having to respond in a very meaningful and intentional and very thoughtful way. So you say things like that or phrase like that to just kind of to move past it. What I'm meaning by this is that, to answer the question directly, is it was for the matter. I learned it not for the sake of anybody else, but for myself because I was having questions about the faith.
Like a Tolkien, not to steal some thunder from that. Like Tolkien had some issues with his faith, and actually he got in contact with C.S. Lewis, and they grew a fantastic relationship. He made him a better Christian. Is that something? So your sort of relationship with C.S. Lewis?
Exactly. When I started,
Become a better Christian and a better man.
we'll become more intellectual
Yes.
about it. The thing that just I like this book from this guy, the way he thinks. His name is Francis Schaeffer. He has a very interesting argument that I like about the Christian church.
Mhm.
Somewhere along the line during the 20th century, the Christian church has abandoned the way of not just the art of persuasion, but they've abandoned the intellectual factor of their faith. They've abandoned it and they adopted a new form of activating themselves or
The Catholic Church.
how do I say it? A new form of worship and expression of their faith. By that I mean very simplistic, and by simplistic I'm referring to it's all about just believing in heaven and believing that Jesus died, and that's all that matters. Whether it makes sense or not, it's all predicated on the faith. Not anything rational, not anything in the essence of truth, not anything philosophical.
The knowledge as opposed to the
Philosophy can
understanding.
be a danger to a lot of people in the church because it seems to be exploring other ideas and thoughts, not exploring the nature of itself or what's been observed in the object or nature in its natural and organic fashion. That's why I believe Christianity has never had any kind of problems or anything with science or philosophy. They've always been in union. They've always been in unison with each other. But somewhere along the line, we broke that, and we've allowed. I think the Christian church. I say allowed because I want to say that they kind of. Francis Bacon had a lot to do with bringing in the scientific method, and he had a lot to do with inductive reasoning. Well, he is one who created that discovered inductive reasoning for a while. Well, inductive reasoning came from Francis Bacon because we were using deductive reasoning from Aristotle that the church adopted, the Catholic Church.
The Catholic Church adopted a lot of Aristotelian logic to justify its position.
Yes.
And even in the editorial process in the second half of the Bible was some of it, there's at least some evidence, at least by some Christian apologists and Christian scholars that without sort of that Western philosophical ethos, I guess you could say, and
Mhm.
logic,
Yeah.
we wouldn't have the systems in place. Now, when you were mentioning the departure from simplistic reasons that we have now to
Right.
the more complex ones, were you referring to the Reformation period and the Enlightenment, or are
I'm
you?
referring to the 20s Reformation. Okay, how did it happen?
Yeah.
Because even what happened was, that's a good question. How did it happen? Because Reformation came in and allowed things to become more autonomous. We've allowed people to exercise their faith in their own merit, in their own way, in the way they can feel themselves expressing a relationship with God. Because we no longer need a priest. We no longer need a collectiveness of a church to explain to us what the scripture means and what it means to know God. So that's good. However, I guess it kind of allowed, I don't know what the transition was, because then the humanistic aspect came about in the Renaissance, which means the rebirth. And everything that was once sacred and was once transcended expression, meaning the arts, literature,
Logos.
sculpture. The logos was an expression of the transcendent worship of God into the things that they use and they exercise, like the arts. When humanism came in after the Renaissance, during the birth of the Renaissance, it now became about man as the focal point. Man has become the center of their meaning in the cosmos, no longer God.
Do you think like philosopher like Nietzsche saw that and predicted certain things about the 20th century that came to be true, or do you think that was a?
From what I understand about just reading that little bit of Nietzsche in regards specifically that one poem about God is dead.
Yeah, and thus spoke Zarathustra.
Yes.
Yeah, God is dead, and we have
Yeah,
killed
we
him.
have killed him. Yeah.
Yes.
He
How
wasn't
shall
he
we
was
get
he
this
understood
song back?
exactly the ramifications because he understood exactly he understood history very well. And understand the sociological effects of removing something like that, of removing something that's been the foundation for all of he mentions it in that poem exactly. What activities are we going to now event that gives us a sense of, I'm paraphrasing, a sense of meaning and a sense of direction that was once filled by the religious activities. What are we going to replace that with?
I think that poem is Europe's obituary.
Yeah.
And so in going back to the question is, this whole history is very important because from a macro level, there's that synchronicity, but then there's that cause and effect as well. But from a macro level, and who I am right now as a person, how this affects me, I am now a product of whatever happened from history in the Christian community. Meaning, due to that people's temperament, which I'm sure we have a very similar temperament to be very much inquisitive and looking at things and looking for meaning for things and looking for truth. I always refer to things as engineer mind, the engineer brains, and they have a very kind of stoic and very, they just don't like to, I don't know if they don't like it, but they're not very quickly inclined to look at things philosophically. And I say yes, I'm categorizing, generalizing people in that regards because it just seems to be this common thing I run into. I talk to an engineer and it's like it's the quickest conversation in the world. I can already tell, but you're not telling me that you're an engineer just by the conversation, and 9 out of 10 I'm usually right, and I'm not in any way a prophet or anything of that nature.
I'm a wannabe Lewis.
Now, so here's the thing. When it came to reading again in these books, it was a default because someone eventually goes through a faith crisis. And there's a dissonance that happens and it's very unpleasant. And one has to decide in himself, I'm not gonna, which I noticed a lot even when I got to meet people from Ireland and even here, they always say things like, man, it meant something to me, the faith meant something to me, but then I read this book, or I watched this documentary, or I heard this guy speak about evolution or about philosophy. I even heard a guy say once that philosophy leads you away from God, because the more you study philosophy, the further you get from God. And he didn't really give an example of what that meant, what that looked like, but that was his conviction.
I've heard similar with philosophy against psychology. I think that's ridiculous as well.
Well, in psychology
What
too.
do you mean by that?
It's been brought to my attention that be careful with philosophy, and I shouldn't say attention. I've heard, be careful with philosophy. It can muddy the waters, so to speak. I'm paraphrasing, but muddy the waters of psychology, and I think that's absolute BS. I think that someone who is biased towards psychology and perhaps didn't find something that they liked or found something they didn't like in philosophy that challenged their knowledge at the time. That's all. It's similar to what you're saying with religion. It challenges them, and instead of rising to the occasion of the challenge and say, okay, how does this challenge and how can I strengthen my faith, quote unquote, in what, be it religion or psychology, they would much rather accept that it's a competition against the two.
Yeah, that was definitely in the early to mid 2000s when I was exploring more of my own faith, or I guess personal lack of. Something that struck me against people who I really envied had a lot to say about philosophy and was very little. Richard Dawkins, Lawrence Krauss, Neil deGrasse Tyson, all basically dismissed philosophy as mental masturbation, essentially. And that it's,
That's a $5 word right there. I'm gonna
Yeah.
start using that during
Yeah, so-
this conversation now that it's been opened in the word
Something-
bank.
something
All right,
like-
we're in 404, no more.
something that, like, well, we don't really need philosophy now. We have science, and I sort of rejected that fundamental. I'm like, wait a second, that's an interesting philosophy you got there. That philosophy is not very useful. Don't you see these sort of kind of walking paradox that is?
Yes.
And it came to my attention when, as I studied more philosophy of science as a subdiscipline within philosophy, specifically epistemology, that some of the greatest scientists of all time have been really remarkable philosophers in their own right. Not necessarily the great ethicists or anything. I think of Einstein. He even produced a series of papers, including a book on the philosophy of science. Max Planck.
Isaac Asimov?
Isaac Asimov is a great scientific communicator. He was very philosophically grounded. You even look at Carl Sagan, and at least the ethos surrounding philosophy, he respected it. But a lot of the sort of the new atheist types, which I would associate with only by lack of belief, I used to say, and not politics, they have very little to say. It's very dismissive. I'm like, how could you be so dismissive of something that was so important? And it wasn't until later on in life where I made the same connection with religion in general, specifically the seeds of the Reformation and Enlightenment. How could I talk about the Enlightenment, which I adore, without talking about the Reformation? They seem to go hand in hand. And in turn, started looking at more history and more American philosophy and the seeds of which planted things like the American Revolution, specifically the French Revolution. Like, how can you talk about one without the other? Then I went back and was like, wait, there's a philosopher who already talked about this very thing, this cyclical heuristics, and it was Hegel, someone who I was not that familiar with, but had read a few small works when I was an undergrad, and I've been sort of struggling with him recently, and it's sort of been a struggle that I've been really having with my own work, with the stuff that you'll eventually hear on other recordings. Now, I've already made one recording. It was sort of a introductory one, and I worked on it for a couple days and met up with Hector, and we did all the editing and everything like that. And it was a cool experience, but it was a good place. Now, for those who are listening to this, I'm like, well, that was really polished, but you sound really unsure. Well, there it is. I'm unsure, and I'm still exploring, and hopefully you could see the evolution in the next recording. It'll be more formalized opposed to this one. I just want everyone out there to know that you don't have to have a PhD in a subject to talk about. You don't have to be an authority figure. You can keep yourself in account up to a certain degree, but having others push back on you is really important. That's why the community is vital. And you don't want just people who are going to validate the ever-living shit out of you.
Yeah.
You need people to push back on you occasionally. And whether it's a soft push or they have to rough you up a little bit.
That's right.
It's going to be important, and that's why the feedback's always really good. I know some of us feel still like a little intimidated by the topic of philosophy, so I'm going to switch it to something else. Can I ask you something, Hector?
Sure.
Could you just tell me a little bit about so your passion for music, and specifically what you like to do? You don't have to sell me. You could just
No,
maybe
you're
tell me
okay.
a little bit about why you do what you do and how you got there.
The irony is I absolutely hate the sale of music. That's one of the reasons last year I had and I mean this in all senses of the word, a fantastic experience in music that I'm also very glad ended. I tried a new project and it was great. It was a lot of fun, but it also helped me realize that just like some of my previous addictions in life, it was no more than another addiction that I was giving into. And so the sales aspect does not appeal to me in any way, shape, or form with music, but it's the ability to express myself in the manner I feel most comfortable, first and foremost, doing. And secondly, from an intellectual standpoint, I'm always looking forward to trying new things in music. It's not for the sake of others. And that's the part of last year, 2018, that I didn't care for. Along with the creativity came some business aspects and sales and the modern day way of pushing things on people. And that's just, to me, not the foundation of music. I'm not knocking people who do that. I mean that sincerely when I say that. Everyone will say, oh, I'm not knocking you. And it's rhetorical. I mean sincerely. If that's what you want to do, go for it. I encourage you to do that. I love that you're passionate about that. But my passion didn't lie there. My passion doesn't lie in selling music. My passion doesn't lie in sharing it with everyone. Hey, look at what I did. My passion lies in, hey, this is how this mood felt, or how this particular vibe was, or the instruments that were playing in my head, and this is how it came out. And it's the best way that I know how to express myself. So that's my tie to music. It's a great way for me to express myself. And like any vice, though, you can get lost in it. So be sure that you're self-aware enough to pull yourself out of those, what we sometimes would call a writer's block, is a lot of times music telling you to shut up. That's just the best way that I could say it. I'm sure you've experienced that as well. But it's a nice way to express myself. But at the same token, like I said at the intro, I do need to shut up sometimes and listen. And music also allows you to listen. So that's my time. It is indeed. I hope that gives you an idea as to where I stand with music and how it ties to philosophy for me.
I think that really ties into how I see business and how I see anything I disclose or utter out of my mouth, because since the current conditions I'm starting to see is now I'm an adult. As a kid, nobody's going to believe anything I say about my childhood in the boomer generation. Gen X, I found they're very receptive. Millennials are like, no shit, of course, why do you expect anyone to listen to you? Of course the boomers won't listen to you. So we start to see these categories of demographic visions of who we speak to. And disclosure is always, well, who do I speak to? So I always have to build context on the spot. And I've been learning a lot. The most self-defense thing I've ever learned that's best for me was in business communications class. And I started to learn how to interface with, it's like lion taming. You're talking to the corporate beast. Your information that you're disclosing, you're choosing to disclose at least, you have the illusion of choice, is that you can say things and the mysterious people in the dark listening to you, watching you digitally, or remotely, or however, through the window, whatever kind of violent voyeur you may encounter, who's trying to silence you in this witch hunt of our age. I've started to find out if you put on a good show, you may change your observer. And I love this episode of the Andy Griffith Show that has the policeman and they're having Christmas in the prison cells. And this man is like, God, I want to get arrested. They have Christ in there. And he's like, they're just having such a good... So he starts committing crimes outside. And I kind of relate myself to that old man in such a depth that it's going to take a long time to unpack, but that's basically, a little image drop right there, that little trailer of who Cisco is, the story he wants to tell to the audience right now. Because I think you always have to know information has a face. And when it's disclosed, you have to tell where's it coming from, what do you think? And when I say philosophy, I love wisdom. I would love to share my YouTube channel with people. I just want to make sure they don't want to murder me first, especially if they're online and they're listening to me.
You martyr.
Yeah, you get martyred. It's worth it when you had something good to say and everybody heard it, and it's like, all right, we got a full-on worldwide religion now that we said this.
Do you feel
good?
Do you feel prepared to defend yourself against those people?
Once I have a coalition of people, because I've actually thought about this a lot, I give it an absurd, insane amount of academic thought. I'm actually thinking about the tactics of every communication detail. Everything is chess with these murderers on the social media now. I want to say your name, but I'm going to hold off.
Please avoid that.
Yeah. So that guy who died. I'm thinking it's worth it to get the message out, but you got to be a smart Mercury. You got to be a smart Hermes. And I like Hermes Trismegistus. That's an invitation to a lot of body literature I'd like to share with people. There's this thing called a Hermetic seal. And I've started to find there's things that the nature of reality starts to lash out against you for trying to utter or disclose to people, because the evil of the world that governs this world does not allow you to say these things, and you have to first establish enough context with people to be able to open up that window
credibility.
Exactly. Credibility. The Overton window is an example of this concept
Right.
of what people are willing to accept. And it's like, I've gotten to learn, I started thinking, if I can't talk to people, I can talk to computers. And I started realizing, okay, well, computers don't understand each other, but people do. And sometimes they pretend to. Why do they stop pretending to? Because in this generation, they're forgetting it. And I have this thing called the Bible that I read because I learn about the awful things that happen when they don't pay attention to these basic logos concepts. And it's like, when you're in a library and the only book that's allowed is the Bible, it's a problem. When the only book isn't allowed is the Bible, that's also a problem. Bookman's, for example. Screw you guys. I'm sure you have Bibles, but I know how you feel about it.
I was just about to say I'm
Just
gonna have to
roasting
edit
you
that because
guys.
I just
I'm
saw
just
an
roasting
entire
you
section.
guys, a little bit of hyperbole. That's my
Hyperbole.
that's my
Hyperbole.
chutzpah coming out right there.
Hyperbole.
Chutzpah, as the Hebrews
Yeah.
say.
Hyperbole.
No. Well, something that we discussed in one of my, actually, was it my first or second meeting with you guys at the coffee shop? I actually proposed that we talk about something a little more context-driven, and I suggested Plato's Allegory of the Cave.
That's
in
perfect.
Plato's Republic, Book 7, actually. And it's a series of dialogues about this very theme. Not necessarily the Hermetic Seal, but I would say the Hermetic Seal owes some sort of credence to that original story, at least from an archaeological standpoint. If you're to look at the Republic as an artifact, so to speak, that inspired a lot of offshoots. So the basic premise in the Allegory of the Cave is we're all born into a certain nature in an environment that we're slaves to our senses and slaves to the shadows around us, and we're shackled literally to the walls of an underground cave. And our reality, or what we describe as reality, are just nothing but shadows and plays on the wall. And that one day, by happenstance, someone might be released for whatever reason. Whether they just struggle out or they're just let go, who knows? That's not the point. Point is, as that person ascends up to the surface, their muscles are atrophied, their eyes are having difficulty seeing because their eyes have only seen the darkness for a really long time. So eventually they make their way outside the cave, and they realize along the way that everything they saw was completely inverted. It wasn't the shadows that were real, it was the things casting the shadows, and that it was just an illusion. But eventually, once they reach the surface, it's so painful and hard to see because they're surrounded by light. But now what do? Well, they decide to go back down into the cave to share with the other slaves who are against the walls. Like, this is what I saw. This is great. I want to share this wisdom with you. But do they do it openly? No, they ridicule the man. He has no credibility with them. There's no relational context. And I guess it's sort of like the philosopher's dilemma. And Nietzsche also hammers upon this in a whole new way with his Zarathustra character and hero. And Zarathustra does the exact opposite. He goes to the top of a mountain for a good while, and then he comes back down. So he has a bird's eye view of what's going on below, and he comes to share his honey or his wisdom with others. And at first they're reluctant, and then they mock, and then they fear, and then they accept him for who he is. It's sort of a transformational thing, but not without sacrifice, not without personal, without blood, so to speak, whether it's your physical blood or metaphorical. Hardship, yes. So it's extremely difficult. It's a difficult transformation.
At that point, once you started mentioning Zarathustra, my imagination started racing a little bit. So I was like,
so these themes pop up over and over and over again, and it's glad to hear that you're like that. It sounds to me like you're almost to the point where you're to the surface, or almost at the point of the mountain, and you may want to descend at some point. The question is, how do you do it safely?
Yeah.
First and foremost, and I'm no stranger to the news of people being doxxed and being harassed and whatnot for their ideas and ideas alone, whether it be just your skin color and traditional like bigotry and sexism, all this stuff that everyone knows about, but also just for being maybe, let's say, a white male, which I am, or maybe because what if I was a Christian, or maybe because I'm a Republican, which I'm not. I understand that, and I think it's probably important that from a pragmatic sense, you really have to take care of your house and your household stuff. So if you're going to put yourself in danger by something you're going to say, you really got to be prepared to stand on the mountain. And I think of someone that we all know of was prepared to do that, Jordan Peterson. The weirdest thing happened with this guy. He could have gone for the rest of his life without uttering anything controversial, and no one even cared. But he decided to take a stand on a weird mountain, and he was attacked and ridiculed and feared. But now, his ideas, or at least the manifestation of his actions, led to a lot of people waking up to all sorts of ideas. So in a way, yes, Bill C-16, that's kind of a strange thing to stand on, if you think about it. It's like, well, who cares about compelled speech? Whatever. He decided to take a stand, and consequently, we have a cultural phenomenon where people are, wow, you know what? Maybe I want to go to the library and pick up a book on something that I haven't really read before, but I've heard other people talk about. Wow, why is there all this opposition? Why are all these news articles coming out about young white men meeting up and being dangerous, when obviously it's not true? I'm in a group of people from different backgrounds, different politics, different religions, an actual diversity rather than just the melanin in our freaking skin. So it's extremely encouraging me, because I want to guess your age. I'm assuming you're younger than me. I'm 30, and
I'm in my early 20s.
Yeah, so we're all different ages, but this common thread, these common
Zoomer.
a zoomer. As long as you're not a doomer.
Oh, I'm a bloomer, man.
Is it more dangerous? Is it more dangerous for people that all agree to get together and talk about things, or people that disagree? I guess is an interesting question. And like, obviously every group is different, but I feel like the more they agree or the more they have in common, the more likely they are to convince each other about little intricacies and all come to one common goal, whether it be good or bad.
So this is something that, not to bring back to Peterson again, but something that Peterson's discussed a little bit. Think of the metaphor of the garden and the garden keeper. Is like an ancient motif, like a Jungian archetype, where man tends to his garden, because without tending to it, the weeds and the plants that shouldn't be growing, that provide sustenance for the man, grow out of control. But to put too many walls and exclusions prevents the plants that need to have a little room from growing. So in a way, a lot of echo chambers are maybe a little too walled, perhaps, and free-for-all, like sort of libertarian idealism, when I'm a libertarian, being completely free may be too much at times, where you have a wild, wild west, where you might have, I wouldn't want an MS-13 person in here talking to us about fundamental rights when, I would be very weary of something like that, because they're probably prone to violence and maybe a little too open to their own interpretation of what was right and wrong. I don't know if I could reason with someone like that. On the other hand, I don't want the same person as me in every single chair in this place, because I might as well just look at the mirror. And like, there's no challenge for growth. And I'm just stroking my ego at that point. So, I'm sure as we get to know each other, know each other's backgrounds, we'll be able to have that pushback. Sometimes a soft push, sometimes a nudge, but I'm going to invite it, because I think it's important for growth.
It's inevitable, I believe, especially when you're dealing with things that people who have different convictions. And I think the word conviction is very important, because if you don't understand your convictions, it's a worthy pursuit of what it is and how you orient yourself and how you interpret information from the outside world. Because whether you receive the information yourself, we're still malleable, we're still vulnerable to influence, even in the subconscious state. But I think your question is really well and it's really good, because it's one of those questions, is that very particular question that made me skeptical of a group like this. Only because I've always wondered, as a person who's exclusive in my belief and exclusive in my convictions, fundamentally, I've asked myself, how does that even work with people who are exclusive in something fundamental outside from this? When I almost imagine, is there any room for persuasion when you hold such solid ground and such deep roots like that? And I finally realized that maybe it's the wrong angle I'm looking at. Instead of looking at trying to uproot the roots and then change and transform and just rearrange. It's more of like, okay, let's look at the whole nature of reality and why you see it the way you see it as a, let's just say a Muslim sees, or even a Hindu, because Christianity and Muslim are just, there's some similarities, but obviously only superficially.
Abrahamic, the stem was Abrahamic religions.
Right, and that's about as only similarities we can get there. Other than that, everything else changes. But like as a Hindu who believes in karma, in karma, the law that they use, and as well as the 330 million deities and how they worship these deities, and all these different things that are involved there are way different than just say an atheist. These are two radically different worldviews. And the worldviews consist of so many of certain components on how we view meaning and purpose, which is again an innate thing in every one of us that I believe in, and would argue that we do need as a human, as a species, that we need. It's a necessity that we need meaning. We need it as much as we need food, as we need sex, as we need intimacy, as we need water. It's one of those components, one of those things about our faculties that is very much also and also indicates to us as the nervous system as well, to say, you need this, otherwise there's consequences, mental. So with that being as a focus, I think, not fully focused, but being a focus, as well as seeing that, he's on the fence a lot, so I'm gonna challenge this on this fence, and I'm not, so he's gonna challenge me on why I have such a strong stance in certain things, and how do I stand firm in that? How do I articulate such a thing? Is it something that I'm prepared talking because it's a collective thing that my community does? And I'm adopting this conviction because I want to have an identity? Well, we'll find out, because I hope not.
Yeah, in a way, on his fence, maybe you could see further along your side than you can with your own eyes, but from your perspective, you could see how unstable he is sitting up on the fence. So sometimes maybe he'll jump down, or maybe you'll push him on the other side. Metaphorically speaking.
I hope it's not a dog on the other side of the fence.
I'm always, funny thing, I think that's the
I hope
key,
there is a
something
dog
I've
on the
been
other
thinking
side of the
about a
fence,
lot.
actually.
I think,
Rise to the challenge.
I think because what we're doing right now is we're talking into the void, and we're hoping that the voyeur can be planted with the seeds that we're spitting out here of what we're saying, and it's just also we're just thinking out loud. And I think with Stefan Molyneux, one thing that makes it special is this guy made the largest philosophy channel ever. So it's just, this is the largest disbursement of philosophical knowledge that has ever happened.
Informal, yeah.
Informal, and he's just speaking into his phone on his way from work with like terrible graphics on his crappy camera, and eventually he's like high budget, going across every Western nation, getting kicked out of nations for uttering things that you're not allowed to say, and then getting the platform YouTube and all these other digital websites mad at him and getting executives mad at him. So it's like, I'm thinking we do live in the historical time that's like, it urges us to pull us to, all right, anybody who does not know this thing, hey, you're in the climax, buddy, and you got to get knowledge about this quick, because people are kind of stressed about a lot. They're not, no one's as like plucking a flute, right? Plucking a harp or singing into a flute right now, like in Pythagoras' time with philosophy, which is what I see a lot of academics get into. Like they're just kind of bumbling through a dusty library, and there's like a bloody crime scene outside the school, and they're like, I just love my books. It's like, well, the thing I always want to get into is what do the books do? How do they manifest themselves in life? You shall know them by their fruits. One thing I know is that materialist philosophy, any of the groups of philosophy that would be considered within denying that there are objective truths, any kind of subjective, totally relativistic ideas start to dominate the conversation in a negative way. And I think you start to find groups of objectivists discussing things in a common goal in a really peaceful way that you would never find in the postmodern setting. And you can invite a postmodernist to an objectivist thought-provoking discussion, but you can't invite an objectivist to postmodern discussion. They are shunned. So the fact that these groups have these morals, it's like, now that I've said that, you people probably have tuned out by now, so that's great. If you want to keep listening, get ready to change.
Well, I sort of push you on that just a little bit since I'm familiar with the topic. Most of the time from outside academic circles, it's just referred to as the ivory tower, ivory tower effect. Now, I've met some very brilliant people who were in the ivory tower, but at the end of the day, I mean, some of them couldn't even tie a tie, right? Some of them couldn't even like comb their hair. So the state of nature in which they lived in, it didn't make sense to me. Like, you are so brilliant and so wise, and you have so much potential for outreach. What are you doing? It's like, and I'm in a different position because I obviously didn't have that power. I wasn't in the same sort of ivory tower. But look at Stefan Mani. You know, he has a master's degree in history and a BA.
He's a theater kid. That's what drives me insane. I'm like, how
and
does he do this?
a BA, equivalent of a BA in philosophy, and that's great and all. But how is it that an individual who isn't in the ivory tower could reach millions and millions and millions and millions of people on a shoestring budget, yet the most brilliant minds of our time, supposedly, reach a few thousand students their whole life? Now think of a professor, okay, teaching either upper level or even graduate level course. They might have 20, maybe 30 students or something like that per class. So you have 2 or 3 classes. So let's do some basic arithmetic. Say you're reaching, say, 50 students, new students a year, and you work till you're tenured, and then you go on sabbatical and you maybe poke around, and you work for 20 years. What is that? 50 times 10, that's 500, times 2 is 1,000. A single video on YouTube on an obscure philosophical topic can get more views in a single hour than that professor will have in their entire lifetime. Now, you have to ask yourself, what's the impact factor there? What do we value as a society? We're probably going to value the professor more because of their status and because of their expertise, and rightfully so. However, I think there's an opportunity to bridge the gap between sort of the elites and the ordinary. And I don't think ordinary is I don't think we should be using that in a derogatory sense. Philosophy as a discipline has been done for thousands of years exactly what we're doing right now, perhaps in different settings, but open-ended discussion, using the art of rhetoric, using logic, having a few central texts that people agree to read upon, and time, right? But they weren't able to scale what they were able to do. We have that capacity now. We can literally upload this video and maybe it's a hit. Maybe it gets 100,000 views in the next 6 months. I mean, that'd be great. I'm being optimistic. But what if we could increase the impact value by showing something in between a polished product, like I would love to do with my more standalone videos and audio recordings, and these intermediate ones, so that individuals who aren't a part of academia or part of some sort of professional circle maybe get some inspiration. Maybe they said, hey, you know what? I want to learn to become an engineer. Okay, so I'm going to go to the library and my spare time on my days off, and I'm going to study math and science. Okay, I'm going to start with, I'm not really good at math. Let's start with college algebra. Okay, I might struggle with it for like a year. I'm going to start doing problems in the book. I'm going to start trying to find stuff online I could do. I'm going to start building up my base, right? What if these types of discussions and these types of projects that I'm mentioning could be extrapolated to other subjects? I'm thinking specifically about YouTube in a way, because this is something that I've always envied people who are really good at music. You think there's something parallel with what I'm saying that could be applied to, say, learning music and becoming really proficient at it? What do you think, Jason?
Go ahead.
I mean, absolutely. A part of music is first you kind of have to be born with a certain sort of instinct, which I believe most of us already have, an ear for music. It's how you know when something's catchy, as opposed to like just repetition, which is naturally catchy, but a catchy phrase or catchy chords that make you want to hear them over and over again. That I know when I struggle with music, my biggest struggle is trying to make something that doesn't seem like it would come next.
Right.
Like there's a simplistic way of looking at chords, and you naturally feel like you want to hear the next chord, and it's hard not to just fall into what you've already heard. And I think it's kind of like that with philosophy too. It's hard to have a new thought. And
Nothing new is under the sun.
Yeah.
That's what we're all trying to sort of look for, and I think that's what true artists in music, that's what keeps them up at night. What frustrates them the most is, I'll write a song and like a few days later I'll hear something and be like, oh my god, it sounds like that song.
Yep. I'm in the same boat.
So I think it's the same with writing, with philosophy, and with speaking. Is we read these books, but we don't want to like just regurgitate it and memorize it. You want it to have an effect on you, and for it to be able to help you create something new.
Inspiration?
Yeah, and that's I'm grounded in music and theater, and in theater, it was hard for me coming out of some intense training of theater. I didn't know what to do or say in social situations for a long time. I didn't know who I was because I was so used to the page telling me who to be.
Yep.
I was so used to practicing becoming those people. And it wasn't until I actually had my own life experiences of failing and loving and all these things. If I went back to true acting now, it would be much easier. Because I started with all the training, now I have life experience, and it would be so easy to go back now. It was so much of a struggle before. I don't even know where I'm going with this.
No, I
So
have an idea of where
opposition
you're going with that.
forges, adversity forges like strength.
I guess once I stopped doing stage work, I didn't have any instruction on who to be anymore. And I felt like, well, what do I do? What do I say? I don't know.
It's
Wow.
I'm very similar in that, and kind of the opposite end of the spectrum. Though last year I participated, I guess would be the right way. I mean, I was paid, so I guess I worked in the acting field. I did a short film and did some small work here and there, and I had done it in high school. I'd done it a little bit in college and such, and similar. You start learning how to be whoever the hell you want except yourself, and when in regards to music, a lot of times I find that's the best way to be myself. And I sum it up with the word intent. The reason why I'm why I'm less prone to getting into acting, even though I still get a million texts from my management company, it's not my desire currently. My intent is not to fake an interaction or a person for the sake of film, for the sake of personal, whatever it may be in the moment, subjective moment, but it's not my intent. Same with music. You said something that really rings to me is I'll hear a song that I wrote, and then I'll hear a song that's already on the radio, and I'm like, damn it. I used that chord progression. It happens all the time, but I think the way I got over it is, well, my intent wasn't to mimic that. My intent was to capture that particular the chord structure or the feeling or whatever my intent actually was. And I can rest pretty easy with that. And it's, as long as I can go back, and I would hope that people can go back in the creative arts at least to their intent and their reason for doing it and feel comfortable with the fact that I did it for this reason and I can't change that because it already happened. So as long as I'm still comfortable with it, great. And if I'm not, well, I'm learning something about myself. I'm no longer comfortable, quote unquote, selling myself for whatever this may be. And I don't mean in the financial way. I truly mean in the spiritual or emotional or mental or whatever way it may be. You're not selling yourself for a purpose. You're more discovering a purpose about yourself. And that's my thoughts on the creative arts, at least, and how they are applicable in a philosophical standpoint.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I really like where this is going. I'm just I'm trying to imagine if there's anything out in the marketplace on the different social media that I'm aware of that you do see something in progress. Now, the thinking in progress motif is become very, very popular in the IDW, or intellectual dark web. At least they talk about it. Talking the Petersons, the Weinsteins, the Dave Rubins, the Sam Harrises of the world. They're very adamant about showing what a conversation, how it can take place. But to be frank, I mean, a lot of these guys they'd be successful even if they weren't doing this kind of stuff. We may even be aware of them. So I'm not trying to say we're mimicking on them like you guys were talking about chord progressions, but perhaps taking a couple cues from them about being as transparent as we can without compromising, let's say, personal safety, or let's say we piss someone listening to this off and they try to find out where we work, try to disrupt our lives that way. I think it's important that we just remain focused and being as honest as possible. And for anyone listening to this, sure, you can clip out anything you want and later on try to use it against us, but this is a work in progress. You wouldn't look at a piece of art that was only halfway done and critique it for its mishaps. You wouldn't listen to a piece of music that wasn't finished. You wouldn't criticize someone's essay that wasn't completely written. Just keep that in mind. So even if someone like me, who you might hear in more formal recordings, sounds like a completely different person, well, maybe I was, maybe I am, like when I'm in that mindset. Perhaps thinking out loud is something that we'd all get used to, and there's gonna be mistakes. We might even misattribute a quote to someone or an idea or whatever. But the idea is that we get better with time. It's sort of like a 10-year challenge, but instead of 10 years, you see 10-second progression, like 10 seconds here, 10 seconds there, 10 seconds there. And next thing you know, like, oh wow, it is possible to sort of develop yourself in real time and then have other people watch it. It's a very intimate thing. It puts us in a sense of vulnerability, and I don't want to speak for you guys, but it is a little bit vulnerable at times.
Very much.
We're expected to be polished when we put something out, but I don't suspect these discussions can, first of all, I don't think they can be like that. But you have to start somewhere. And if this pushes people in, whether they're doing arts or interested in philosophy or history or Mortal Kombat, I don't really know. Maybe they're a professional gamer, I don't really care. But the idea is that they push themselves and understand that, yeah, it's a journey. It doesn't just happen overnight. So.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I would love for people to critique us, and I would love for people to challenge us. I would love for people to try to come at us. I think that number one makes us stronger, and number two, I think it gives us more exposure. I don't know if I'm alone here, but I'm not particularly concerned with people giving us a hard time or trying to cut little snippets and
I'm okay with it.
little character assassinations here and there.
I
From what
expect
I've-
KO you do that to me, honestly.
What I've seen when that happens to people, it tends to create, what is the phrase? They come for the scandal and they stay for the content. So when you have a scandal like Peterson, you referred to the
Bill
whatever,
C-16.
yeah, C-16 bill. He had this big scandal, and all of a sudden he was spotlight of the world. And then everyone found him, and then everyone said, wow, this guy actually has a ton of great content.
Thousands of hours of
On his
content
channel.
before that.
Yeah,
His
it's
lectures in
fantastic.
class, let alone are remarkable.
Yeah.
I was a personal thing. I was aware of his existence before CC, before the bill happened, and it's because he had gotten exposure for just putting himself out there by putting his lectures. And
Mm-hmm.
I discussed with my partner before. I was like, why isn't it more commonplace that why aren't we recording more of these things in lectures in every single university, in every single campus in the world? Like, I don't get it. Why is it that what's so exclusionary about it? Now, there could be something said about copywriting and stuff like that, and I guess there's something to be said there. But why aren't people self-selecting to want to do this in the first place? It's sort of strange. For as much, not to get too political, for as much socialism is pushed in the universities, why aren't they pushing out, free lectures on their topics? Whether it be something as mundane as mathematics, but I don't see it for the social sciences. I've searched for it. At least not on YouTube. You can find some stuff, but it's usually centered around a few people, or they're a little older, or what have you. Not to say the content isn't there, but it's like, okay, yeah, you can listen to a Fields medalist talk about mathematics and a mathematical topic for 2 hours, but you can't find, feminist theory 101 anywhere. And if you do, it's a 5-minute video by BuzzFeed or something. It's like, what if we want more substantial content to deal with, but we're supposed to, I guess, listen to the old guard. I guess you consider them the old guard now, and take it by faith. And like, no, put your stuff out there so we can engage with it. We're putting our stuff out there. Why don't you? I don't know. I didn't mean to go off on a tangent there, but
No, you're right.
It's
And
fair.
it's strange to me. It's really strange to me.
I look at it from a motive perspective, I suppose.
Exactly.
They're already getting paid whatever they're getting paid for being whatever they're doing at whatever university. I actually don't know if I don't know what undergrad teachers get paid.
So, depending where you're at, if you're like a state university and stuff, a lot of times grad students are teaching these, so they're getting paid through
Right,
a
you said
stipend.
that.
So, the structure might be something like you, part of your tuition reimbursement is that you teach a class.
Ah.
Or sometimes it is in the form of a check or what have you. It really depends on your personal situation, but a lot of undergrad classes are taught by grad students, and to their credit, most of them are doing the best they can. I'm not going to try to talk trash about them all, but I've literally seen and experienced seeing grad students prepare their lectures an hour before class. They're rediscovering the topics right before they go and supposedly teach it. They're supposed to be authority figures. Like, that's fine and all, but you're purporting it as if it's canonized and that you can't be criticized. Like, no, wait a second. If your students saw you scrambling the last second to do this sort of stuff, how do you think they would feel about this? Now, at least what we're doing here is it feels a little more honest. We're being a little more transparent. You know, some disciplines don't need as much prep time. I would say math is one of those, maybe, or maybe some of the harder sciences, like, you know, F equals MA isn't going to change overnight. You can still, it's been the same for hundreds of years. While gender is a social construct, maybe needs maybe a little more nuance and a little more tap dancing around the subject to sort of report it. Now,
Well,
I'm not trying to pick on the humanities at all. I'm in love with the humanities.
I
but
am. I want to pick the humanities and the balls.
I do want to. I think everything that has been
Girly
brought up
balls.
here in the last couple moments is alluding to people's, excuse me, that's wrong, a general sense of lack of responsibility for your opinion. If you've truly taken the time to formulate this opinion and you want to express it / engage with people and learn more about it, then take responsibility for the consequences. There's no way in hell you can possibly know what the consequences are going to be. But if it's truly of interest to you, then dive in and accept the consequences and / results that come with it. But there's a large fear, and that's speaking from pure experience. I'm not judging other people. I'm judging myself. This is relatively new to me. And I can say I would lie to your face a year ago and tell you that I was ask for forgiveness rather than permission person. Now, today I am much more of an ask for forgiveness, but because I'm willing to take the steps that I think are necessary for me. But most of my life was ask for permission. Now, I'm not going to get into the psychological aspect of how that happened, but I do know that I've been around enough people, because you tend to assimilate with the people you're similar to. And if that's the case, and I've been if I've been around that many people who are so afraid to take responsibility for their own thoughts, God only knows what they're filtering, and they're stifling themselves creatively, linguistically, intellectually, in any possible way. Morally is probably the biggest one that I'm working with right now in my own self. But it's self-accountability and self-responsibility that seems to be lacking, and that's me analyzing myself and saying, oh yeah, I know easily hundreds of people who are exactly like me. Easily.
Yeah. Now, look, it's easy to criticize people who aren't in the room, especially the amorphous, elite and the ivory tower types, right? But, I would love to have this kind of discussion maybe in the future I'd like to invite a random professor from U of A and say, hey, we put all this content, maybe down the future, like, hey, would you be willing to have an open discussion? We'll redact your identity. You can talk freely about what you feel about this stuff, whether you agree or disagree. I would love to have that kind of conversation. And then on the other end, someone who's been marginalized. So, as much as I don't like SJW politics and stuff, find someone who supposedly doesn't have a voice and I want to listen to them. I want to hear their explanation for why they believe what they do and what motivates them. And if they disagree, I want them to press me on it. I don't want to live in a safe space. Now, you may say we're hypocrites for maybe redacting what we do for a living, but we don't have some of us don't have the financial assets to, lose a job over a comment we make on a video or an audio clip, right? And so I'm just trying to take responsibility for that aspect of my life first before I take more risks. Now, I don't know if this resonates with any other guys,
Yeah, it does.
but there are definite people that I would love to talk to. For instance, I'll give you a good example of someone in the community I would love to talk to. I'd love to talk to a police officer.
I have a sheriff lined up already.
Hmm?
I have a sheriff lined up already.
Yeah, like just talk to a sheriff, just open-end interview. We'll redact their name and start talking philosophy with them, and then or maybe a pastor or a priest or convicted felon, or someone who's recently been anything, just something a little off the beaten path. Maybe not just talking about sure, we can talk about Plato all day.
This
But he's dead.
This is the application, I believe. This would be an example of the application of philosophy. Even if because I've always, for instance, pragmatism. That we know just a little bit of pragmatism. It's a prevalent philosophy that came about in America.
William James.
William James and three other guys at a metaphysical club in Harvard, discussing, I think, phenomenology and other things of that nature.
Yeah.
And then they started. I don't know how they evolved to this thing called pragmatism, which basically has if you correct me, the notion is, if it works, whatever works, it doesn't matter whether it's true or not. It's whatever works. So it's not the epistemology of truth that's actually important. It's more, is the application worthy enough to even? Is it worthy enough to apply, and does it still comply?
Does the calculus work? Whether it be like physical, like mathematical calculus or a moral calculus, does it achieve our ends? Now, of course, there's different divinities, I guess you could say, of pragmatism, but I think you basically hit on the nail there. So.
And why I bring this up is because people speak a certain mantra. Like an average person, I say average because a person who doesn't read philosophy, doesn't know much about philosophy, never gone to school, and I asked them, and they believe that they almost in the spell that they don't have a philosophy, but they do, and I think most of them adopt pragmatism because it's the one that's more prevalent, it's the one that's more accepted. For instance, here's an
Also, as an American tradition.
and it's a tradition in our land, so it only makes sense. And so in a mantra that I remember hearing, I think it's like, oh man, just do you kind of thing.
Oh God.
Huge mantra in the music industry.
Huge
It's
mantra
got its
in
roots
every
from that. I'm not
telecommunications
saying
industry.
it speaks pragmatism, but it has the roots from that, it has an influence on that, nuance to that. It has a subjective form of, and of course a bit of postmodernism as well in the mix. And then you got postmodernism as well. It's a relativistic statement, no doubt, by its form. So all this means is that these guys haven't thought it through. And I person, like, what do you mean by that? What does that mean? How did you derive with this idea that you doing is you is what matters the most? And have you thought about the alternative of that? That there's people who believe that doing you is not actually the right thing to do. There's an exclusive way. What if there's an out way to do? Oh, then that is judgmental. That you can't speak that way.
It's very reductive.
For instance, here's an example. There was an argument that was made by a guy who's a postmodernist and a relativist, and he always used the analogy of the elephant in the room. The elephant, that's the four blind men trying to interpret what the elephant is, but they're blind. So one and the elephant represents nature, reality. So the trunk says, oh no, the reality is based off the trunk, and it's a tree. So each part of the elephant describes, because they're blind, a certain component of reality, which they're kind of saying, oh, reality is like a tree. No, it's more like a snake. No, it's more like whatever you would think manifests that certain kinds of characteristics due to whatever they're touching. And then there's a guy whoever this person is, nobody ever talks about it corrects them all, says no. But really they were actually all blind and they were all touching the elephant. Well, who is this man that happens to know what really is going on? Apparently there is an objective reality. Because they're trying to say, well, they're all equally blind. They're all equally, so therefore nobody really knows the truth. But apparently but it still shoots itself in his foot because, well,
This is back to Plato's cave, once again.
it goes right back. And so one says, here's an example, you can't, as a believer, I say, well, I think Islam's wrong. And okay, the person who's Christian, why so? I have my reasons for it. And then relativists will say, you can't do that, bro, that's judgmental, you can't judge people like that. But then again, you're judging me for judging that. You're basing a judgment already on myself, saying what I do. What do you mean by I not to do that? What do you mean by wrong? If you're a true relativist, you wouldn't be able to use that statement.
Perhaps we should substitute you can't do that with, and don't judge with, this makes me uncomfortable, therefore be quiet.
Yeah.
Right.
Or like you could substitute the words with what you're seeing on the outside. If you think from an empiricist standpoint, like what is the person saying something, what are they actually doing? What are they actually doing? Because if they're just using it as a means to shut you up, well, maybe that's worth pursuing. That's something that's interesting.
Yeah.
I'd like to respond to that.
Yeah.
So definitely, I got a phone call from my nephew the other day, and he's not allowed to be a boy anymore. There's no more Boy Scouts.
Oh yeah.
He lives with a single mom, and he's like, I'm not allowed. I don't know if I'm allowed to hear this. And I was saying some pretty basic things that you would maybe hear from a Disney movie in the '90s, like believe in yourself, kind of just basic corporate slogans that used to not be vilified. in today's day and age. But now it's like when I disclose something, I think maybe the walls will crush on me from hatred from what I say sometimes. But I'm thinking when there's a stock of good men that want to love wisdom, which is what philosophy is about, why you clicked on this thumbnail. I think you're here because the biggest question in philosophy, every other philosophical question, every question is, what is the meaning of life? How do I live a good life? And every philosophy tries to say, how do I approach that and implement that in my life? And I think this condition is not a good one. The good condition is the one where you say, I do want to hear people entertain ideas without, even if they don't accept them, and eventually I want them to accept the best ideas. If we have that same common goal, then I feel comfortable speaking around you. And now I feel like I can open up around you, internet stranger listening in. Because it's like, I talk to my phone every day as if it's the devil. I'm like trying to convince the devil not to kill me, and I'm solving my own murder when I'm Googling things on the internet. Because I figure this thing's going to be tracking my granular data anyway, so I might as well negotiate with this thing. This amorphous entity, which I see it as just an abstraction, and I call it a spiritual being.
Ghost of the machine.
Yeah, it's the ghost, basically. So I think I love philosophy. My position is I love mathematics, and I believe that mathematics, we are the expression of it. It wasn't just invented, we are living it. And our place is to be stewards of our reality.
Type thing?
Kind of more like logos is the underlying blueprint of reality.
The word?
Logos is a character.
Oh, logos, not logos?
Logos. Logos.
Okay.
In Greek, you would say logos, I think, that from what I've heard from people try to translate Greek.
Yeah, that's the next video that I'm talking about. I'm talking about Heraclitus' use of the word logos in its original context. Now, the Greeks, he didn't invent the word, it was in common use, but it wasn't written down in any formal setting until he came along. Now, there doesn't seem to be any physical evidence that anyone preceding him used it philosophically the way he did. Hence my interest in him as a starting point in this whole thing, because the logos has become more of a attractive topic in a lot of these different circles, including at IDW. I think in Jordan Peterson specifically, and Carl Jung, who's had a revitalization in our culture, and just Western philosophy in general. So it's interesting that you mentioned that.
I think one thing I want to respond to the allegory of the cave, because I really like that. I think I compare it also to first The Matrix in 1984, because I first heard of the allegory when I was a kid, right?
Yeah.
And my parents did me the great gift of giving me really thought-provoking books when I was a kid. Interesting books that got me to where I was at in my development, and not all kids get that. So some kids don't like looking over at the table and seeing the kid who did, but I think, you can get your kids those things. But when I had the allegory of the cave, I started thinking a lot about the people who don't understand me, and my nickname was Mambit, and that came from Mamon, which means sucker, which means pacifier. So it basically means shut up. So every time my name was altered, it's like, after I say your name, I expect you to shut up. So that's every single time my name was said, that was the response. So that's who I was talking to. And the world I found was actually less mean than that world until it started boiling with social engineering on so many telecommunications levels and deceptive, subversive tactics that were so overt to me as someone who was artistic and philosophical. And I started going, well, I'm going to get to media so I can get positive messages out there. And then I started seeing, okay, it's not peaceful out here, so I'm going to get into business where I can actually invest in a long-term thing. But, philosophically, I think these conversations need to take place. There's a lot of channels I admire. And speaking about focusing on the Matrix, right?
Which channels do you like?
I really like Stefan Molyneux. I think the man kind of is right now struggling in public to fully say what he's allowed to say, considering he's been kicked out of several countries. And he's like, man, do you want me to take that social risk on my channel? On a certain live stream he said recently. And he's like, go bother some other channel. And then he kind of, later that week, started tongue-in-cheek responding to that. But that at the same time, you're kind of giving responses to certain echelons and excluding from others. And I like to just risk it, and like Socrates, I'm going to say for that little boy, for the unborn, I'm going to say it for him because that's what he needs to hear. And if I don't, you're all screwed. There's no Josiahs waiting for you. And Josiah is a character I'd like to get into. It's a little hyperlink there. If you don't understand what that is, I'll explain it in all due times. I like to plant little seeds like that when I have this spur of the moment thought. But I used to do film in school, and I was in the behind the scenes kind of guy. I really liked other people getting on stage for me because I never felt comfortable on stage. And now that I'm on stage, it's kind of interesting. Oh, that's my mom. I'm gonna hang up real quick. Sorry, mom. But one big thing I like to talk about is the Matrix. I like to talk to people through movies because it's like most people can't even. If you ask them, they can't picture images in their own head. If you ask them, when you read something, you get pictures in your head. A lot of people think they don't. I like to just, I like to gear my discussion to people that do, but I'm not gonna stop the conversation for every disabled person I can. This is a tricky thing about talking into the dark. But here's the thing: I'm gonna just straight into the point. Jump in the cold water. Okay. The Matrix. The idea is you go from this kind of computer setting. It's the allegory of the cave, which is a more probably the modern person isn't relating to the person who's just disabled walking out of a cave, atrophied, and they probably don't want to talk about that. So you have this commercialized image that's more polished, and it's like here, it's what you want to now. It's a cool movie. It's got big boobs and leather and guns, and you'll watch it and you'll get philosophy.
Yeah.
And it's like finally you tuned in. Okay, now you ever hear this thing called the red pill? Most people have no idea what the red pill is.
What's really popular as a meme, especially
Exactly.
on the internet, taking the red pill being like waking up from the dream and being able to see the world for what it really is. And there's bitter red pills, and there's going back to sleep, taking the blue pill, or being apathetic towards any sort of challenge that might alter your view of reality, ultimately.
Yeah.
I have to clear something up. You said The Matrix 1984. We're talking about the movie, right?
Oh, I'm talking about Matrix and
the movie.
the text.
I was going to say that
1984
came
by
out.
George
Oh,
Orwell.
okay. Whew, that scared the shit out of me for a second. I'm like, bro,
it scared
I know
me
I'm
at
getting
first.
old,
Yeah.
but The Matrix came out in '99 only.
1999.
That's what I was going to
That's
say.
the funny. I wish 1984 had a more like different title, but I say George Orwell's texts. I can now say, that's a better one. Because that also includes Animal Farm, but I actually had a teacher speak to me in Newspeak, so I realized I'm now living that book. I'm in that story. I'm a character. I'm Winston now. And now that I'm like, okay, well, do I have the balls to say this? Is there a party member in the house? And people are like, what is a party member? Well, if you look at my book and the story that I'm in, I don't have time for this. And so it's kind of like, when I disclose myself, when I talk to the dark, I hope these suggestions I'm saying, these new things, some of these things may be new to you. I hope they're interesting. And I hope that, I made an off-putting comment earlier, but this is off the cuff, so who cares? And if you try to use it against me, I compare you to the soccer player whose only tactic to winning a game is pulling out a red card and crying and making a fool of himself in front of the whole world. So I'm winning here. I just got the upper leverage on you by disclosing myself as I want to disclose myself, and you have to pull out the red card to beat me. So you get that, demon in the dark.
Well, going back.
Going back. I'm sorry. I'm so used to talking to demons in the dark who spy on me.
Going back.
They bully me.
It's okay. Well, anyways, we've been kind of going at it for a little bit. Do you think maybe we could start?
I was going to say, I'm going to just do a part 1 break here.
Yeah.
We're going to take a little one because we're at the over an hour mark on this. So I want to make sure that we don't have too much information. And I'm not going to get into the technical shit because no one gives a fuck about that. But I'm just going to pause it.
Okay.
And there's part 2 coming soon.
Yeah, this is new.
All right.
Christmas
Check
stuff.
part 2. Yep, we're good.
All right. Well, one of to kind of draw this to something of a conclusion for the night. I just kind of wanted to discuss some of more general overlay what might happen next week with maybe new guests, but also kind of do an overview of some of the elements that will make up the next edited video, which will conclude after this one. The next day or two, I'll be recording with Hector some of the elements that will make up my discussion of Heraclitus and the use of the word logos. Now, the way I came to this was that the term logos has risen again in popular culture thanks to Jordan Peterson and influence of Carl Jung. And I wanted to explore some of the historical significance, and based off of some initial research through some survey catalogs that I've looked at in philosophy, Heraclitus was the first philosopher to really use the word in a philosophical context. He didn't invent the word. It was in common use in Greek, but it wasn't used the way that he used it. And so I'm going to be looking at some of the specifics surrounding that, including digging into some of the texts, which have been translated over and over again, discussing the pitfalls of primary opposed to secondary, opposed to third, or even fourth sources, and how that works. I'm going to bring the listener along the way, and I'll be exploring some of it as well. This is I'm not necessarily an expert on ancient philosophy. I have more of a general overview of the entire history, but I want to be as transparent as possible to that. But it will be a little more scripted, a little more edited, as I pull out texts and quotes from different sources. Now, the length of it, I'm not exactly sure, but I'm thinking between 40 minutes and an hour of edited content, which should be enough for me as far as the amount of work it might take to do that, but enough for a listener to sort of understand where we're going with it, or where I'm going with it. Anyhow, that's sort of the general overview of me and where I'm going. And I hope next week, or when we meet again with another group, or possibly have some other folks who rotate in and out, who are going to be a part of the discussion. I think a big topic we might touch upon next week is, sure, we've discussed where we've come from, mostly in this, and where we stand in a lot of things, but where are we going and how are we going to get there? I think that might be something worth exploring, or at least bringing up. That's my piece. I don't know if Ivan or Hector or anyone else has something to say about that.
I think that's a pretty good introduction to the second part of this. You know, the first part was a lot of giving people an idea of just how random things can go, and that's just blunt, honest truth. These conversations can go one of many different ways, and part of my job in the editing process is to just kind of listen and see how guided they are and how unguided they are. And that's from an objective standpoint as a listener, but knowing that each of us is also going to have individual projects coming along, we're going to have other guests, we're going to have other things going on, should give people at least a reason to come back and listen to more for the sake of their own interest, not because I want you to, although I do, I would love that. But I think if there was nothing for you here, don't omit this. There's more for you in other aspects of what we're going to be doing. And what I'm working with you on tomorrow, to be very honest with you, is very new for me, but extremely exciting, because I'm one of those rookies. I'm one of those people who has absolutely no clue on the surface level what the fuck you were just talking about.
I hope that's a good thing.
It is, because as your production guy, I have no choice but to listen, and I'm interested. So it's all good for me, and hopefully that plays well in the recordings as well. But I think that's going to be nice to give people an idea of what your contribution on a individual level is. And Ivan, I know you and I talked a little bit about you putting your things together, and Cameron's going to be putting his stuff together as well. And anybody who might be joining us, everyone of course is invited to do that. But it adds a little bit of a personalized texture that I think these random group discussions can miss. Sometimes you'll get a little bit of what everybody's about, and sometimes you'll be like, well, what in the world are they talking about? And actually all that's pretty good, because I think this is what people do in their own home, or at least what we hope they're doing in their own home. Otherwise I would examine the elephant or dragon, as Peterson would say, in your home and see what's going on there. But again, I'm really excited to see everyone's individual contribution and everyone's weekly contribution on a group level, and just kind of moving forward and giving people different things to look forward to discussing. I know that I personally would love to introduce the topic of music a little bit more in depth, and not just music. I'm sorry, I'm going to redact that. I would like to introduce art and its philosophical importance, as well as its just cultural importance, its modern day importance, and other people's perceptions of it, not in a lecturing way, but I would really, really like to know how to get the hell out of my own head on people who do and don't listen to music these days. Why they do, why they don't, what are musicians, or people that call themselves musicians, doing these days that is turning people on or turning people off from listening. So I'd like to add that to, in the coming weeks and bring that in. I know that psychology is going to be a very, very big part of it, both with you, Ivan, and with Josh. I know that he's a silent assassin when it comes to that. When he finally opens up, and he's not here with us today, but when he finally opens up, man, does he just, Rambo shoot you down with some psychological. He was listening the whole time, and let me tell you, he built up an arsenal, which I love about him. So I'm looking forward to introducing him in part 2. But oh, it's very well. I'm
This has
not
a
going to leave
sociology
people there.
background, which
He does. That's
which
right.
interests me. So
And a newly formed military background establishing as well, which is nice. And congratulations to him on that. But I think that's all I've got for right now. The rest of it will develop as we come. And anybody else got something to throw in?
actually, Cameron, if you can, I'm just curious, what exactly were you planning to do, like project-wise, or do you have any ideas, like what you might produce on
Yeah.
audio or video or anything like that?
I would be comfortable with audio or video. There's several things. I would really like to have I know Steph has been brought up here before. He does those Truth About series.
Yes.
I think it would be fantastic to have just a giant library of basically major philosophers or poets or whomever.
Like biographies type thing?
Yeah, so you could have kind of like an expository thing,
Mm-hmm.
and then if you wanted to, you can structure it any way you want to, but you can take that expository information and kind of bring it here and have us discuss the expository information.
Like a hyperlink type thing, or like a playlist or something on YouTube or whatever platform.
Right.
Now that's a cool idea. What would make it yours? Like as far as what would your personal flavor be on this?
That's a good question. I don't know. I tend to figure that thing out as I go. That's one thing that's the most recent thing I've thought of. I would like to do something in the finance realm. I would also like to do some kind of, this is probably going to be something between me and Ivan, a more Christian themed kind of approach to things.
Oh, don't leave us agnostics out of that.
You're not invited. I do like
Jesus
I really
invites
do like
everyone.
the idea of video too, because I tend to be more.
Emotive.
Yes, I tend to be very this with my hands that nobody can see right
Okay.
now.
Italian.
So I like those ideas. I really like the idea of communication and just how we communicate, the words that we choose to use, and what's really, like we mentioned this earlier, what's really going on when someone asks a question, or when it was something about like the white male thing, right? Or no, it was the relativity thing where they're like, well, you can't say that, but then they're judging you, right? About you judging other people.
Unearned moral superiority and
Yes.
hypocrisy.
Right. So what's really being said when these kinds of things are discussed?
Okay. I would just
I like those kinds of things. I also love art, and I love kind of diving into film and things like that, and kind of picking it apart and looking at it from more of a symbolic perspective.
are you thinking Jungian, or are you thinking more modern criticisms of media?
Probably Jungian.
Okay. Yeah,
I
there's
would say.
there's a lot of territory out there, even from just a screenplay perspective. I've dabbled in a bit,
Mhm.
trying to understand a little more about some of the visual mediums, and it's fascinating.
It
It's
is.
part psychology, it's part art, it's part interpretation. It's a whole medium of its own, and something I find fascinating, but I've never really invested a lot of time in. But the time I have, it's been very rewarding.
Right. Agreed.
Cool. Okay. I wanted to poke you on that because I heard it's like, oh, Cameron was gonna do. I wasn't sure what you wanted to do, or what you plan to do, or at least where you wanted to start.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Uh-oh. It's Ivan's turn.
Uh-oh.
They call this dead air time. I just want to let you know.
Yeah, it's
Just
just
kidding.
processing it.
I'm just
Well, it's because it's trying to process it because it's all these ideas can be very much conglomerated. I think that's the whole goal, right? To conglomerate all these ideas as we're doing things individually, but yet conglomerate them to something organic where we discuss them, like we're doing the history and understanding the background of certain philosophers or certain poets and where they come from, and why it's still relevant, why it's still pertinent even today, and and why, and even dissecting why that is. What is it about it that makes it so alive and still active? Well, that's the whole thing. I really believe in the case I would make in all this is that the human soul is intrigued by truth. The human soul is awakened by truth. And even whether you believe in the soul, we can call it consciousness, whatever makes you feel comfortable. But there's that mystery within all of us that have been awakened. When you read a book, like you mentioned something about how when you make it your own, he's going to be doing his research, he's making it his own. There's a magic that happens, as we discussed the first time we met, just as when you read, a pretty much, it's a counter response to when people say, you're just reading someone else's opinion and that's all you're doing. When it's completely false, 100% false. What you're doing is you're reading someone's research and someone else's realization of what they've discovered about reality. You're interpreting that on something that's already been processing in your own subjective, with your own new experience, or what's going on here in 2019 versus what happened, couple what happened in whatever year you're investigating. You put those together and there's a reaction that happens, like chemistry. And that reaction is so organic and it's so unique and it's so subjective. Just like with conversations, it has the same effect. When we have different conversations, and there's every single moment, we can't explain it, but every now and then there'll be that moment where we're all like on the same page somehow, and we're building on this phenomenon that happened. We're like, yeah, bro, I get it, I see it, I get it. What is it?
Convergence.
It's a convergence of what we discovered equally. And none of us said, hey, do you see that? Do you see that? It wasn't even like that. We've all just somehow intuitively discovered it. And we say, yeah, and then we build on that structure. That's the phenomenon of fellowship. And then we look at each other like, this was really good. This was really fruitful. We use these kind of expressions, these adjectives. Especially fruitful, like you mentioned, as if something that was nutritious, as if something that was good to the soul, or the conscious, or the well-being of yourself, or who you are. And that's what I would say is the goal, is to make this more active, more vital, more accessible, as well as exploring myself and exploring each other's journey, and basically taking each other and others around who wants to get involved in the journey of a narrative, of meaning, of real meaning and real purpose, finally living it out. And if you don't know what that is, hopefully this will give someone an idea where to start and where to go to find that meaning and purpose, and get familiar with what is truth. Even if you disagree with the notion of truth, at least get an understanding what it is, what it's meant by people who believe in truth. And without being shy about it, but being very raw. And also, that's the third component, is the raw of it. How raw doesn't have to be a negative connotation. Raw could be something that we call authenticity. It can be something where we're authentic and we're very genuine and we say what we want to say, not because we're trying to subjugate somebody into our own thinking or whatever, anything. No, it doesn't have to be connected with vices. There's virtuous aspect to it as well, being raw, but being real, in other words.
Or a component. Think of it as elements that build compounds, which build substance.
And that's
right?
substantive.
And the elements of thought come from strange places. Sometimes it's a random place, but it doesn't mean it can't be led somewhere, or it can't be cultivated in such a way. And that's sort of the whole art of rhetoric. And traditional philosophy is really good at cultivating that. It really is, and it develops strong minds, strong character, stronger wills, for lack of a better word.
That would be something I would like to explore, is character. I read a very amazing, compelling book, David Brooks, that wrote The Character. And I also read this book called 7 Great Men and Their Greatness by Eric Metaxas, about these specific great men and their character. And they both tap into something about character, how it's not, it has to, there are interesting factors that's involved in how the character gets built. It's factors that have none, that the Stoics would like to apply, where circumstances that you have no control over. There's factors of your upbringing and who's important people, like your mother, how a mother actually does have an influence. The mother, because of that nurture and how they have that kind of, those qualities that's different from a father. And all these things help and cultivate character. Also, there's a factor of what's going on around you, what's calling you, due to the abilities and the things that you're actually good at and what you actually have in possession and in position you are as well in society. All of that. So it'd be great to just dive into these areas where we're not unfamiliar with it, which is because it's part of who we are as humans, but it's just not exposed enough because we are not making it a priority. We're making superficial things priorities. We're making things that are not meaningful a priority. We're making things of fear a priority. So dismissing all these things, actually no, countering all these things and bringing the real stuff, the stuff that really matters, the stuff that the soul that you're hungry for, because the existential problem is that. That's the existential problem. That's what nihilism is winning for, and is winning in it because ultimately there is no meaning. It's what nihilism says, right? And they have every right to say that. It seems that way. Doesn't mean it is. It seems that way because we have forfeited this other aspect of reality. And therefore you get this, and therefore you get the default of looking and thinking this is what it is, the nihilism. I think that.
What would you say? I'm sorry, but what would you say to someone who's listening and then all of a sudden thinks to themselves, "Well, who the hell are you to tell me what meaning is?" I mean that sincerely. I know it sounds joking, and that's the standard way.
right.
But who
It's a
are you or
fantastic
any of us
question.
in this group to tell someone else what meaning is?
Mm-hmm. And I would say it's not about me saying what meaning is, it's just giving examples of what meaning looks like due to this continuum pattern, and also by even looking at it from psychological angle as well, and what that looks like. So this would be good places to explore what meaning is, and the fact that even Viktor Frankl has a good argument of what, if you read his book, you'll see it in his Logos Therapy, that it is something that he alluded to something existential where you're responsible for your meaning, meaning that it doesn't matter if you believe it's objective or not, but what does matter is that there is some kind of hunger inside you that needs meaning. And if you don't have that, it does have consequences. And that's what I'm saying, is how to avoid those consequences. How to not, of what? Depression and anxiety, basically, is what underlies that. And that's what I'm saying, is if you felt depressed and anxious, it may be because you may be lacking meaning. And the inverse of that is why Peterson was so successful, and why one of the reasons why he's so successful, and why what he's saying just gravitates to so many people. It's because he was talking about meaning and giving people a narrative and telling people you have a narrative in your life and there's something you can do about it and you could have something significant about you. For real? And it's not coming from a preacher, and it's not coming from motivational speakers, coming from someone that actually done research on this stuff. I suppose that had a big influence on why it had such a great response.
Meaning through the adaptation of responsibility, and that the meaning of your life is proportionate to the amount of responsibility that you accept. So it's not just about you're just a person. It's about ideas and things that transcend the flesh and makes them more universal. And that's, I think, hence the appeal that ties into the archetype of the hero and the hero's journey. And
Exactly.
we can get deep into that as we progress too. And I think it really ties well with everything you said. I think there's a lot of coherency and a lot of shared language. And as we unpack a lot of it, we sort of nest our perspectives in there as well, as much as we can. So,
Oh man, it'd be good.
that's a good point.
It's a good journey. It's a journey worth going, which was Socrates' point. Examine your life. It's worth it.
Mm-hmm.
I
I would
think if you
say-
look at the cover of a textbook, you see Socrates on the cover, and it's the death of Socrates, and it's something that little story right there has a lot to unpack. And I think every time you see someone speaking truth to you and opening up to you, they're risking themselves to the vulnerability of a hostile reaction or an unpositive reaction, or maybe just a neutral reaction. But whatever the risk is, I always think the bounty, the reward is much greater, and that it's not worth keeping the silence forever. Even though sometimes it's, you gotta win that war. You can't just lose all those battles. That's what I'm saying. You gotta keep splinter open the conversation for liberty.
So, as far as your personal thing, I heard a lot tonight about pragmatic things such as business and financial type things. And I know you listen to a lot of different people, and you seem to be taking in a lot of information from all sorts of places. Do you think this is a good outlet for you to express yourself in a way that you want to be heard, and then more importantly, to sort of, I guess, redeem yourself in your own personal journey moving forward? Like, what are your thoughts and feelings about that?
I do. I also think I don't open up around people who I don't know anymore, unless I feel like I used to work in sales, right? And working in sales, sometimes you need a wingman, and that wingman sometimes was my boss. It's the same thing when you're trying to pick up a girl. It's like philosophy is the love of wisdom and it's kind of like you kind of gotta seduce a woman into loving you. You gotta be like a musician to seduce the love of wisdom into others, and especially if you want to live very long and not go the Socrates route, which I think Stefan, he's a very brilliant guy. I brought him up because I'm watching him very carefully, the success that he has, because I'm thinking, I'm running out of ways to talk to anybody these days, let alone my cell phone in the car. And it's just getting into a more angrier world, which is kind of funny. But when I think if this turns into kind of like a tree house of philosophy, that would be a very nice place. I think people would like to tune in their ears rather than the modern state of academia, which people actually don't really want to get into very much.
Forgive my redundancy, but do you feel alone in your loneliness?
I feel like I have a strong brotherhood online of people who have been touched by a very powerful historical divine force, and that if we are allowed to speak, the world will be just a flourishing, beautiful place. And even if we're all coming from different places, those of us coming from the outside, people who have been outsiders, people who haven't been allowed to speak, or even in the public sphere or Overton window, that once we pierce that, like Joe Rogan, beautiful things happen when like a simpleton cousin of mine asked me, yo, have you seen this Ben Shapiro video? And I'm like delighted to hear that, because this person has opened up the world to Logos rather than the world of needless hostility. And I like people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who's someone who speaks logical arguments and in the philosophical realm, and she comes from an Islamic background in Somalia.
She has every reason to be as hostile to the world as the world's been hostile to her. But she chooses to do otherwise, and chooses her words and her experience as a sort of something to bludgeon other people with, but as an aegis against any sort of criticism someone might give her because of her skin color, or because of her sex, or because of her religion, or her background, or nationality. And she's risen above that all using these same things we're talking about and that we're fantasizing that we could do in our own lives. And it's someone that, if people want to listen to more of, I highly suggest. But go ahead. I'm sorry.
That's perfect. That's exactly the perfect response that expounds on something. It's like, it's letting me know that I'm being heard and that I'm not in Columbine right now, which is how I felt in academia my whole life.
Like you're being held intellectually hostage
Exactly.
to the ideologically possessed.
Yeah,
To steal the
exactly.
phrase from Peterson once again.
Exactly.
Yeah. So
I couldn't have said it better myself.
right. Okay. Well,
And that's a very friendly way of saying it, because I can borrow on your psychologies, on your hearts, on your interpretive methods, on your
heuristics.
heuristics and strategies and ways of saying, hold on, maybe that's not a friendly way to see the world, maybe that's not an effective way to see the world, because it's like you get pushed and your urge is to push back, but that's not the smart thing, because maybe that's what they want you to do, and that's exactly what they want. They want the soundbite that makes you an unfriendly, nasty soundbite that tunes people out. But if you can be the friendly guy that people just, like that that 50s show I mentioned earlier with the guy that's like, man, I want to be in that jail cell.
Griffin.
Yeah, Andy Griffith's show.
Well, you've studied judo, so you understand that in the application of judo, it's not about necessarily applying force; it's about redirecting it to a neutral place. And if this whole stage is something like the UFC, sometimes grappling with someone's probably better than trying to punch them in the head, and sometimes you need to keep your distance, and sometimes a nice left jab might help.
Exactly.
Now, I'm not a martial artist, but I think you get the idea what I'm trying to say. Exactly. Different tools for different situations.
Fooled me.
Different.
What you're talking.
Different tools for different situations, but I think people who are unfamiliar with any of this stuff will understand what you're saying. And people who are intimately following these different movements and these side movements and these different little groups will understand completely what you're saying. So I think that's a good message.
And I love talking to people, letting them know, hey, there's an issue, and that's why I'm having difficulty disclosing things. And then they hear something they've never heard before. Why? Because that's like a book falling from the sky for them. Because they've been in these circles where information is so policed that they've seen something that's fallen out of the matrix. There's a glitch in the matrix, and for a lot of people, I am that glitch in the matrix. And sometimes it's like a boxer coming at you with jabs, and other times it's Barney the dinosaur. And sometimes I run out of little gumdrops to put on the ground, and then I kind of want to take the sweaty fursuit off and the dinosaur suit off. I don't want to say fursuit because that insinuates another audience I'm auspicious about.
No.
But no offense to furries for now.
Now, anyways.
Well, does anyone have any final words? Anything like that?
I do. I think, and this is not in any way, shape, or form an attack on your character, Cisco. I would just say something that I feel compelled to say is be careful the people you choose to be around. They create the world that you think exists. And it's not saying that it's a bad world or a good world. It just gives you room to observe. And not only are you observing the behavior of the people who are in your world, but you're observing how your behavior is affected by it as well. And that's a huge, huge misstep in my own life. I'm just going to put it to myself because I'm pretty adamant about not speaking for other people anymore. It's a huge misstep in my own life to A, allow people who don't belong in my world, and B, not allow anyone in my world at all. And it's a balance thing, and that's the Taoist in me, of course.
I think Marcus Aurelius would have a lot to say about this.
Yes, he would. Yes, he
Speaking
would.
of Marcus Aurelius, I'll say one last thing as well. I'm actually reading Meditations right now, and in
Love it.
Meditations,
I love
he
that.
says, he's kind of talking about his early life, and he was kind of rejoicing about how he was interested in philosophy, but he wasn't exposed to the sophists. I don't know if anyone really remembers that line from the book,
I do.
but I guess that would be my way of personalizing the whole
He learned more.
library of information.
He learned more from the people that were close to him than he ever did from the supposed wise sophists.
Right.
So notably his own
right,
father,
right here.
his own father, and people who trained him and who educated him as he grew up. And in the Meditations, which should serve as probably the sort of the grand picture. Like if you want to know what a Stoic is, you read the Meditations.
Right.
You want to know what Stoic philosophy is, you read the Meditations. It's always a good starting place. It wasn't it wasn't designed for a lot of people to read. It might have been designed just for him. He might have had no one to talk to. Yeah, there's evidence to support that. He had no one to talk to. He had no equal. Right? He was ruler above all. If he wanted to kill you, he could. If he wanted to have a brothel of beautiful women, he could have. But he showed restraint in the same way that Socrates moderated his own sort of his passions, his impulses. And he took a lot from ancient philosophy that preceded him, but also he made himself an example of what philosophy could be. So, the closest what we would call to a philosopher king. So yeah, I think that's pretty cool that you picked that out. Yeah, that struck me in the first few readings of the meditation. It's like, oh, sounds like his biggest influences in his life came from a very practical place. His father educated him, his rivals growing up, and he expanded upon that in something like an open diary. We're just fortunate enough to be able to read it, right? So I think that's a great thing.
The fact that the entire first chapter is giving thanks to everyone who helped influence him
Yes.
is a huge
He didn't
factor.
have to do that. He could have just said that he was because of divine edict or because he was inspired by...
People barely put that at the end of their modern book today.
Right. They might have a little
Little
forward
blurb,
or...
thanks, Mom.
Yeah.
Thank you for supporting me through 2 years of financial distress while I research and toil away at this book. Right. Yeah.
Thanks God.
Humility, I guess is the word we're looking for.
I'm a trader.
Yeah.
I went to God. I'm a trader. Anyways. back to me.
Anyways. What are you going to do with that $1 million? Oh, yeah.
All right. Well, I think this is probably a good place to end it for now. And
If I may,
Jason,
please
yes,
do.
Jason, go ahead.
sort of to expound on kind of what you were saying about we're talking about things landing on people and how it makes them feel. I think that's sort of my takeaway tonight. I kind of want to ponder on that and maybe bring it back to the table. Hopefully I'll have more to talk about next time, now that I kind of know the format, how far you guys have delved into philosophy and what you enjoy discussing. For me, with music is my life. I was born to convey it, and it took a long time. I thought I wanted to be an actor. I found out after training as a singer, dancer, and actor after 2 years was a far better singer. And that was my natural talent.
Gift.
That I am the instrument. Through, not even necessarily through words, but it interests me how sound lands on people and how it makes them feel. If you hear like Coldplay's Fix You, if you know that song, just the opening strain, even the man who wrote it said, I heard those chords and I just knew. And it brings you into a temple, that song does. Or if you hear like the opening notes for Start Me Up, which is classic rock, you immediately feel like, okay, let's go. Just those little sounds can cue you. And I think it's interesting listening to all of you talk, and even just at the rate of speech that you talk. As you go back and listen to those, and you listen to the people that you listen to online. That's the point of learning communication and learning voice and diction, and my least favorite class in history, public speaking. I've never been more terrified than in that class. I got up and sang with the Phoenix Symphony at like 20 and 21, go bring it on. And I went to public speaking and was just like, and I couldn't write anything and I was terrified and I was pretty sure I just dropped out. I was like, I can't do this. I can act on stage, but it was just something about the format of how they wanted you to communicate and judge you. And it felt so unnatural and wrong. But I think that's just the philosophy of trying to understand how it can make certain people feel one way and other people feel a completely different way based on what they bring to the table. So, I'll try to be a little more eloquent in our future conversations. Can I share a song with you guys?
Please.
It reminds me of a little bit about each of what you all are talking about. Before you leave these portals to meet less fortunate mortals, there's just one final message I would give to you. You all have learned reliance on the sacred teachings of science, so I hope through life you never will decline, in spite of Philistine defiance, to do what all good scientists do. Experiment. Make it your motto day and night. Experiment, and it will lead you to the light. The apple on the top of the tree is never too high to achieve. So take an example from Eve. Experiment. Be curious, though interfering friends may frown. Get furious at each attempt to hold you down. If this advice you'll always employ, the future can offer you infinite joy and merriment. Experiment, and you'll see.
Very nice.
Thank you.
Were that your words?
No, that is Cole Porter.
Okay.
Little known song by Cole Porter.
That's cool.
Circa
It sounded like a
1940s.
1950s song to me.
Yeah, probably 1940s.
Good voice,
Simple
man.
piano.
Decent voice, I like it.
Thank you.
I like it.
Well, that was fun.
All right, there it is.
I'm going to go ahead and hit the stop button now. Thank you for listening.